Will the foods that you choose today affect your kids, your grandkids, and maybe even further generations? The science says yes, and here's how. Famine is a severe and dire time for those that struggle with it. While famine is not the norm in our current society, it has been a consistent part of our history. There's a reason for the saying feast or famine. The reality of dealing with a famine is that it's going to affect health. But the question is not how's it affecting the health of the generation that's currently experiencing it, but does it also show effects in future generations as well? And the short answer to that is yes. We've seen evidence that grandchildren of malnourished women show more health complications. But again, in our current society, most of us aren't dealing with true famine. But are there still implications that show that diet can affect future generations? Well, if we look to the current findings of modern science, we see that the food choices that we make today have direct influences over our DNA and how that DNA is expressed. And this can certainly impact children, grandchildren, and most likely even generations beyond that. The concept that I'm introducing you to is known as transgenerational nutrition. Just think in regards to trans meaning across. So we're talking about the effects of nutrition across generations. And again, this is not just the next generation, it's maybe even to the third or fourth generation. A good analogy for this is to think about a library. If your DNA is a library, then food decides which books are going to be read. So just like you walk into a library and you have the decision of which book you're going to read and interact with, when it comes to your DNA, food is what's governing how those interactions of your DNA are going to be, or how they're going to relate to your environment. This is a term you may have heard of, known as epigenetics. And it takes us back to, ultimately, if we want to optimize the health of our offspring and their offspring, that decision is anchored with us in making the choices for our diet. Allow me to expand on the concept of epigenetics for a moment. If you think about this in relation to your genes, food becomes the on or off switches. It's telling certain mechanisms to play out, or it's inhibiting certain mechanisms from playing out based on how the food directly interacts with the genes. And we see that foods themselves can do this, specific nutrients can have this effect. And I'll give you one example that is a pretty common term in the current functional healthcare space, and that's methylation. It's just simply the movement of carbon groups or methyl groups, carbon and 3 hydrogens. It's just the movement of those groups around in the body. But it's methylation, and it's an important process. And methylation is not the only process that is an example of epigenetics at hand. There's multiple of these that come into play. There's also the use of something called microRNA. And so when you make choices in your food, especially if you're someone who eats organ meat, then there is microRNA in that organ meat, and that microRNA is going to have direct influence over the expression of your genes. And that's not to say that you have to consume organ meat, but it is the point to say that the food choices that you make, and with the recognition in this example that organ meat is a higher nutrient density food, typically considered when typically compared against just muscle meat or your skeletal muscle meat, then you begin to see that the inclusion of that category of foods, by virtue of the fact that these microRNAs can interact with your direct DNA and allow for genetic expression to play out, that becomes an epigenetic optimization in your diet. The point here is that that's not just affecting you, it's also affecting your offspring and your offspring's offspring, and carrying on so down the line. Now, how exactly does this play out? Well, if your genes are optimized, that's going to overall optimize your health. And so if you think about the combining of a sperm and an egg and the transference of that DNA into the offspring, if you have good optimal DNA function and expression, that's going to carry forward. And then so on to the next generation. But if you set the groundwork for that DNA to be unhealthy or to not be optimal or to not have optimal interaction with the environment, that gets passed forward. And it's not something that can be undone in a single generation. Now, it doesn't mean that future generations, if you've made mistakes, are doomed. That can ultimately be undone, and all of our personal choices ultimately affect us. But what it does mean is that if you're in that initial generation and you've made poor choices and passed them forward, it's going to be more difficult for the next generations to optimize their health just because they're starting from a lower status. So lower starting point, a less optimal genetic environment is where they're starting from. But again, everybody has their own individual choices to make here. I recognize that it probably feels like up to this point I've given you a lot of theory. Let me give a real tangible example here. What moms eat before and during pregnancy, it sets this thermostat for lifelong health for the offspring. When mom has poor dietary choices, that maternal diet, that mother's diet, is going to alter, to go back to an example I used earlier, it's going to alter DNA methylation. And the genes, when you talk about the effects of stress and hormones, blood pressure, metabolism, methylation can be integrated into every one of those conversations. So if you've got a mom who is carrying excess weight, more weight than she needs to, she's not making the best dietary choices, then DNA methylation is not only going to be affected in her body, in her health, but that's also going to be affecting the baby at birth. And when you think just simply with this one that the methylation process is required for optimal DNA replication, you can very quickly begin to see the impact that could have in a young individual just needing to grow and develop in the optimal way that they should. So if you're having absence, if there's an absence in that diet of nutrients like folate and B12 and choline, when you have optimal protein coming into the diet, there's specific amino acids that are derived from that protein that are critical to continue to optimize this methylation process. And again, methylation, I'm harping on that one because it's a common one, but remember, it's just one of many different processes that can be affected by the diet that can transfer into future generations, this whole transgenerational effect that we're looking at. So whatever's on mom's plate today, that becomes the child's operating system tomorrow. Now, don't feel like I'm solely picking on the ladies. And ladies, there's another part of this conversation that is related to men as well. So men, you're not off the hook here either. Dads matter in this conversation because remember, half of that DNA, well, that's coming from dad. So the sperm is going to carry these epigenetic instructions too, how the genes are interacting with the environment, and that's going to be shaped by lifestyle. So dad, if your lifestyle is suboptimal, you're making choices, poor dietary choices, you're carrying excess weight, you've got some glucose intolerance, then you're going to show altered DNA. Again, I'll use this methylation example. You'll show altered DNA methylation. You're under a more chronic inflammatory state, and that's going to cause metabolic changes throughout the body. And as it relates to the progeny, you're thinking about passing along the DNA that's in that sperm. Well, what if that sperm is damaged? What if that sperm is unhealthy? Then logically, how can you expect the offspring to be fully optimized if what's coming from dad is not optimal, or if what's coming from mom is not optimal, or maybe worst of all, that neither parent is optimal in their health, and now we're truly seeing the negative effects. And this is where you can start to see these dietary impacts begin to have true long-term transgenerational effects where it's affecting into the third generations and maybe even beyond the parents. So dads, you're not off the hook here. If you're exposing yourself to toxins or smoking or poor food, or you're just doing things that are rewriting your DNA in the wrong direction, yeah, you're part of the problem too, and you've got to resolve that. So it's not just about passing on eye color here, or hair color, or maybe you've got wavy hair or straight hair. You're not just passing on those kind of characteristics. You're passing on characteristics that are going to affect the day-to-day health of your offspring. And I think that's part of this conversation that we typically overlook when it comes to making optimal food choices. We're often thinking simply in regards to the here and now. I just need to eat good food because it's just affecting me. Or you look at it as, oh, it won't really matter. What's the big deal if I eat, have a couple of bad dietary choices here and there? It's not going to have a real impact. Well, it does have a real impact. And we can see now that it does it through the DNA. And if those things, there's also the longer time frame perspective here too, in that if you set that child up for a poor metabolic state of health, to not optimize their epigenetics, their gene and their environmental interface to allow those to interact optimally together, and then you layer on top of that an environment and a mentality where they're more frequently exposed to suboptimal food choices, it's just truly stacked against them. We don't want to do that. We want to give our offspring a situation where we can allow them to flourish. I think every parent inherently wants that. And to do that, we have to recognize that the choices we make, even before that child is born, but certainly when at the time of conception and just after, and even into those early years of life, our dietary choices are very influential over our children. I've mentioned the methylation throughout this particular conversation today, but by again, no means is that the only one here. It's just one outcome that echoes across multiple generations. So you've got the DNA methylation, you can have damage to the mitochondria, and mitochondria is said to be donated. The mitochondrial DNA is said to be donated from the mother. And so when you're damaging that with poor environmental choices or living in a poor suboptimal environment, that's a better way to say that. When you're living in a suboptimal environment, you're exposing yourself to poor lifestyle choices or poor dietary choices. The mitochondrial DNA that's getting passed forward, the energy production for that individual, for that offspring, that's set back, that's suboptimal now. The gut microbiome is going to have disruptions, and that's going to start sending the wrong signals to the DNA. We're going to start seeing damage to the DNA. So you've got that problem. You get accelerated cellular aging, and now you've got a mother potentially who, let's just say, for example, she's been making dietary choices that are in the wrong direction throughout her teens and 20s, and now she's in her early 30s. And she wants to conceive. Well, you've got accelerated aging on the body tissues because of what was done in those early stages of life, in those early decades of life. And you can only undo so much of that. So inherently, you literally are passing along what would be an expected shortened life expectancy in the children and in the grandchildren. And, bad food isn't just about empty calories, right? It is truly a thief. It is stealing years from the next generation. And I don't think anybody listening to this would consider that ideal or consider that desirable for their offspring. While this all sounds ominous, let's be honest here, I'm making this out to be a pretty bad picture. But if you're listening to this and you're on the opposite side of the equation and you're someone who makes good lifestyle choices, who has had a good diet, or if you're even someone who recognizes that I didn't get the best start, but I'm going to maintain control of my outcome, of my future. Well, first of all, good for you mentally for being in that headspace. That's awesome. That mindset is important and it's going to serve you well. And the good news is that this story that I'm talking about in relation to having a poor start and these negative transgenerational effects, these epigenetic changes, they can be reversed when you start to consume real food. Now, I will say more about when it comes to proteins and meats. I said a little bit about that earlier with the organ meats, but let me just talk about plant foods here for a minute, because I'm not anti-plant food by any means. So when you start looking at the benefits of eating real foods, whether you're eating things like broccoli, or whether you're drinking green tea, or eating fruits that are rich in polyphenols, these foods are all going to have compounds in them that are going to serve metabolic roles, whether it's enhancing detoxification pathways, whether it's reducing the inflammatory processes, what's often stated as oxidative or nitrosative processes on a more advanced level. Regardless, these real foods contain components in them that are going to stabilize metabolism. They're going to optimize how the DNA interacts with the environment. And so when it's time to have optimal DNA expression, you've got foods there that can enhance that. When it's time to decrease DNA expression, you've got nutrients available that can impact that. And an optimal epigenetic diet isn't just about consuming more, broccoli or plant-based foods. That's not what I'm suggesting here at all, okay? It's about having a foundation of clean, nutrient-rich foods and proteins. And I'll now start to allow me, because again, I'm saying, hey, you want to consume these plant foods. They have a lot of valuable attributes to them that you don't want to leave out of your diet, especially if you're trying to optimize your genetics here. So you also want to include in those clean sources of proteins. Remember, I talked about the organ meats earlier and just how valuable they can be into this conversation, especially when you start to look at the nutrient density in those foods. If you're not an organ meat person, don't sweat it. Just get good quality protein sources, pasture-raised chicken, grass-finished beef. That's where you need to start at. You need to start with a food source that you can trust, that you can build on. And if you're looking for somewhere to lean into to access these things, this is where Harvest Hills Ranch comes in. We have the availability of the grass-finished beef. That's the only way we raise beef around here. When it comes to chicken, we only pasture-raised chicken, right? We're raising everything in a regenerative manner, using the organic feeds, making sure that these animals are living in the most pristine environment, so that when you consume those protein sources, that is optimizing your DNA. And when you pass that DNA along to your offspring, and then they pass that DNA along to their offspring, and so forth, every generation has the opportunity to improve. So it is a positive transgenerational nutritional trend that we're looking at versus a negative. And this is where you have the ability to be able to take control of that. Every bite that you take, for example, from Harvest Hills Ranch, guys, it's truly more than a meal. It is a generational investment in your health. The greatest inheritance that you can leave isn't money, it's resilience. And science now shows that we can stop the cycle of damage and truly reset from the failure. So choose real food today. And that's what's going to allow for your children and your grandchildren to inherit health instead of debt. And if you want to see how you can avoid one of the toxins that could put you on a negative transgenerational nutritional trend that you may not even realize is in your food supply, go ahead and check out the video on the screen right now. You won't believe what I uncovered.